So good morning and welcome to week 2 of Christmas Crumbs Under the Table. This is the Advent week. I'm Christopher Forster. I'm out here walking my dogs. That's Luna and Banjo. Today we're going to be looking at how Mark presents the origins of Jesus, which does have something to say on Christmas. It may not be explicit, but we'll see it as we unpack it a little bit. So we were thinking last time, obviously about the fact that the early church tells us Matthew wrote first, and he wrote in Hebrew. It's probably reflecting the fact that the gospel starts in and around Jerusalem, mainly amongst Jewish communities. Peter, of course, disappears at the beginning of the 40s after he's arrested by Herod Agrippa, who controls all of the old areas of Herod the Great and a bit more. So he's now persona non grata in that region. He disappears. The early church tells us to Rome, where he establishes the church, and Mark goes with him. And it's in that context that Mark is writing. And so while Peter probably has the Hebrew texts that eventually become Matthew's gospel, which might include at this stage certainly some of Matthew's birth narrative, he actually starts kind of Jesus' story from the coming of John the Baptist. And before even then, right in verse 1 of Mark's gospel, it kind of starts in a way that is actually very relevant to the Roman world. It starts with the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Some manuscripts omit that phrase, but I suspect it's the original. The Son of God, and that's actually very similar to the way Luke introduces Jesus as the Son of God. Because the Son of God is very relevant in the Greek and Roman world. It's been Alexander who's taken that idea of being the Son of God very, very literally. He has a big, amazing kind of birth narrative. Some critics say that's why the Gospels include one, because of the fact that Alexander believed of himself that he was divinely born, and so on. But we're not going to go there now, we haven't got time for that. But equally, of course, Augustus in Rome takes that title too, Son of a God, meaning, of course, Julius Caesar in this case. And so Son of a God doesn't actually necessarily mean you're divine. It actually, though, means that there is something of God's mark and favour on you, and you have been endorsed by God, and therefore the gospel that Mark is going to tell them in this Roman world is actually the true way in which you are marked out as God's son. Not by conquest, not by killing people, not by being a victorious leader, but actually by self-sacrifice for the love of others. But then Mark's gospel gets interesting.
You're always friendly, aren't you? What's her name? I've forgotten.
Luna.
Luna, that's it.
But then Mark's gospel gets interesting, because you see, verse 2 of Mark is one of those verses that likes to fuel conspiracy theories, although in actual fact its slight unusual position it sets up is actually very easy to resolve. But it starts with the words, as is written in the prophet Isaiah, except that many English translations don't have the prophet Isaiah, they just say the prophets. And that's because then straight away Mark doesn't quote Isaiah, he quotes Malarkey, see, behold my messenger. And so that kind of, oh no, he's made a mistake. That's the kind of the logic. So let's hide the fact he made a mistake. And by about the 5th century, we're finding copies of the Gospel of Mark that have dropped the word Isaiah. But ironically, it's one of those things that kind of actually pushes back to the antiquity of the Gospel of Mark, and also the Hebraisms of Mark's way of thinking. So Mark may be writing for a Roman church in Greek, but he is actually I'm sure he is. He's like Paul, he's a Jew who's a Roman citizen. So typically, if you are a Roman citizen and you're Jewish, you have your Hebrew name, you have a Latin name or a Roman name, a Greek name that is easy and understood by the rest of the empire, and then the third name is the one that's less used, is the name of your original patron. Who may be several generations back now, but the person who brought your family into citizenship in Rome. So while Mark is a Latin name, Marcus, he is, as you can see through his gospel, and a lot of work's done on this by people like Jean Corminiac, who translates a lot of the Dead Sea Scrolls back in the 80s. His writing is kind of steeped in Hebrew grammar and Hebrew thinking. And this is one of those times, because actually it's not at all uncommon when you're about to quote, particularly someone like Isaiah, who is the arch prophet of the Old Testament. He foresees the whole sweep of kind of Israel's history, from their kind of their survival through the Assyrian regime, through their loss to Babylon, deportation, and then their glorious kind of return. He sees an arc of prophecies in 3 waves of prophecies. And very, very quickly the early church had spotted a kind of a connection between the waves of prophecy in Isaiah and the life of Jesus. And that's probably being reflected here. But in a very kind of rabbinic way, Mark does what often the rabbis will do. They're about to give the big quote, the big revelation, and they introduce it with a kind of a crescendoing sense by quoting from somewhere else. And as a Hebrew thinker, that would be really obvious to Mark, but it's less obvious to us now, because Mark actually quotes from Malarkey, a verse that includes the name Malarkey. So my messenger in Hebrew is Malarkey. Malak, which is messenger, and I, which makes it my messenger. So Malarkey is reinforcing the message from Isaiah, which is the message of a forerunner. You see, it's one of the prophecies of Isaiah, that there would be someone who comes before. And of course, the very last prophet in the whole of the Old Testament is called Malarkey, my prophet. He's not that prophet that Isaiah has prophesied, but somehow his message is reinforcing. And then there's a great gap until along comes John the Baptist. And John the Baptist is that Malarkey. So it's not a mistake by Mark, it's just a way of thinking about the world and the way of understanding the kind of interplay and wordplay that the rabbis loved in Scripture, creating a kind of crescendo until he quotes in verse 3 from Isaiah himself to introduce John the Baptist. And that's really appropriate starting point for Mark's Gospel, because John is quite well known in Rome. They say, why is that? I haven't heard that before. It's often one of the puzzles to people that Josephus spends more time writing about John than he does about Jesus. But the reason John is better known in Rome is John got involved in Roman politics. So let me just tell you a little bit of the backstory, and then what we're going to think about is, of course, John is part of Jesus' birth story. I mean, those events actually come from Luke's Gospel, but actually, so that brings us to Christmas, so Advent week 2, we can do Mark's Gospel. So a quick explanation of John's role in politics. You remember, of course, in the Gospels we're told that he's arrested because he's criticised Herod Antipas for divorcing his first wife, and then marrying his brother's wife. And then, of course, he's arrested, and then eventually he's executed. And that might seem to be the end of it, except that actually the implications of this little incident are actually quite big and reach all the way up to Rome. I do apologise for my very noisy dog. Herod's first wife was the daughter of a neighbouring king, an Nabatean king, the name of Aretas, I think is how you pronounce it. And Aretas disliked Herod, and this was kind of a bit of a final straw, and he mulled on it for a few years. And around AD 36, so a few years after the crucifixion, there's a conflict, a military kind of battle between the two over territory and border lines and so on. And it kind of escalates up, and it's quite humiliating for Antipas. In the end, Rome gets involved, and they have to send the army down. And that's about 37. And then around 38, Herod now is accused in the Senate of conspiring against the emperor, and he has to go up and give an account, and he's going to be exiled in around AD 39. Now, by my reckoning, you see, and by the early church's reckoning, Peter and Mark got to Rome in the early 40s. It's just a couple of years after this has happened. And there has been a full trial, and of course, the Roman trials weren't kind of fiascos, so there would have been a full story. Oh, and it should be said that the Jewish authorities actually interpret this loss of the battle and the humiliation by Rome of Herod as being a consequence, divine consequence of Herod's arresting of John the Baptist and executing of him. So it almost certainly, therefore, has been talked about into the Roman Senate. And the early church in Rome, which we're told by the early church writing about the original church, how it founded, has a large contingent of converts out of the Praetorian Guard. The very soldiers who are kind of very interested in this sort of military campaign, they surrounding the emperor and so on, and protection of him. And so it's very, very likely that John is a character whose influence and impact is actually kind of well known, not just in the Jewish community in Rome, but in the kind of the wider multicultural military community too. And so it kind of makes sense in that sense to start with a character they know something about. A character that is significant, because that instantly kind of draws them in to kind of as an instant sort of endorsement of the character of Jesus. So that's how Mark starts his gospel, which means in many ways, because he doesn't start at Christmas. He doesn't start with the birth narratives. But John himself, of course, as a character, goes right the way back to Jesus' conception and so on, as we remember. So just as we're doing an Advent week and we're looking at the four Gospels, I thought we would draw in some of that material, even though technically it appears in Luke, and it does mean next week when we look at Luke we've got more space to just think about the shepherds and the kind of context there. So obviously the birth of John the Baptist it's a fascinating story, and it introduces us in the New Testament sense to Gabriel, who is of course the most famous angel. You talk to any kid, they know the name, the angel Gabriel. Interestingly though, Gabriel only appears in two books of the Bible. He appears in the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and in the book of Daniel. In Luke he appears twice, once of course to Mary, once of course to Zacharias. But the thing that's interesting to kind of notice is that in the Bible, Gabriel's role is kind of purely involved in announcing a sign and a countdown towards the coming of the Messiah. So in the book of Daniel, we read that Daniel's praying at the time of the afternoon offering, and in the Gospel of Luke, Zacharias being chosen by Lot to make one of the daily offerings. And there are two. He comes out and there are people praying. It's clearly the afternoon one. So Daniel goes in, he's praying, it's in Babylon he's praying, but he's praying at the same time as of day, and as Zacharias is when Gabriel appears to him. And then Gabriel says to Daniel, he gives him a countdown, famously, of 490 years, 483 to 490 years. During that time, the Messiah would have been publicly presented, he would have completed his mission, and everything would be, that would be an end of sin, you see. So the countdown for the Messiah is given to Daniel, and similarly, we get a bit of a countdown, though it's not as explicit, in the Gospel of Luke. So this time has to be the day he gets back. Some people try and calculate the dates of Jesus' birth that way, but it doesn't really make sense, doesn't say it will be the day. That's going to be the sign. If it happened immediately, the sign would have been that Gabriel had turned up. The point was, at some point, she's going to become pregnant. And that is a countdown, that marks the countdown to the Messiah. 6 months later, Gabriel visits Mary, of course, and she gets announced and she conceives. So you take the 9 months, typically, that you take for a pregnancy, if you think of it in those ways. Take 9 months for John to be born. An extra 6 months later, Jesus is born, and 40 days later, the presentation, if you add up all of the various points, all of the various days, you actually have a countdown of 490 days. Just as Gabriel in Daniel's Gospel are given a countdown of 490 years, 490 days later, Jesus has been circumcised. That's it, I think it's circumcision, is it? Anyway, I should check these things before I start out with my dog, shouldn't I? And so it's just kind of interesting to see Gabriel's kind of key role seems to be as the countdown marker for the coming of the Messiah. Now anyway, coming back to Mark, because we ought to finish with Mark rather than in Luke, seeing as we're doing Mark for the second week of Advent. So Mark has presented Jesus as written down by Isaiah, and he's then kind of focused on a character that the Romans know, which is the coming of the messenger who's first prophesied in Isaiah, though Malarkey makes it nice and clear. But actually his whole gospel is framed by the prophecies of Isaiah. So right at the beginning, of course, Isaiah famously prophesies the virgin birth, and that's part of the first wave of prophecies in Isaiah. So there are 3 waves. Then he focuses on the suffering of a servant who suffers unjustly the punishment for the people. And then the final phase of Isaiah's prophecy is he looks to the future and a future return and a glorious king coming back. And of course the early church saw that those, while they fitted the history of Israel, that they were actually more significantly related to the story of Jesus. And that kind of thing actually has quite a lot of resonance in the Romans. They love to see that kind of framework of prophecy. So I think that's perhaps part of the reason why Mark declares right up front the whole of this story is prophesied before. And Jesus is the Son of God. Well, Alexander was very excited when it was pointed out to him that some of his victories were prophesied in the Old Testament, the book of Zechariah, for instance, I think it is, and was very thrilled about that. And so the idea of seeing all of Jesus' ministry framed in the prophecies of Isaiah would be very attractive to a Roman audience. Which is probably what Mark is driving at. So while he doesn't particularly add to our understanding of the immediate events of Christmas, he is drawing on some of the context that makes sense of that event in his presentation of the gospel into the Roman world. Well, so next week we'll be looking at the story as it's presented in Luke. So see you then. Bye.